Thanks, Ted, and everyone for inviting me along here. Ted just joked that I've been doing the stadium tour. I did do the Barcelona stats conference at the New Camp recently, so the attendance is looking decent. So I'm going to talk about charts, which might sound really boring. So kind of the point of what I'm going to do here is trying to make charts less boring, more interesting, and just talk about how data, graphics, charts are ultimately just forms of communication, and that all of us who work in this space should think about them more explicitly as forms of communication, and that if we do that, we'll all be better at our jobs, and football and the wider world will be a better place. So with that broad brief, I'm going to start with a question. Why do we bother making charts in the first place? I am sure I'm not alone in the room here in terms of somebody who spends a frankly unreasonable amount of time making charts. So is that all a waste of time, or is it actually achieving something? And my response to that, which is based on data, based on evidence, is that that's because charts actually do change people's minds. And I don't say that just because it's a convenient thing that justifies my own viewpoint. It's because there's actually really good evidence for this. So a particular study was done a few years ago in the US by a couple of political scientists, Brendan Nyhan and Jason Riefler. Now, what they wanted to find out was, are charts, graphics, maps, whatever, just more effective at getting information across to people than other forms of media presentation, as it were? And the way they decided to test that was they were going to take a divisive issue where they knew people were going to have different views, and then they thought, let's see how charts compare to like a single sentence or a paragraph with numbers in it in terms of its ability to persuade someone to change their mind and follow the evidence. So that divisive topic was global warming, and they took a group of American Republican supporters, either people who were sort of moderate Republicans or strong Republicans. So a group who, as you can see on the chart, there was some skepticism towards the idea that global warming is happening. And so they start out just by asking a simple question: do you believe global warming is happening? And this group have just been given that question, no other information apart from a single sentence saying that global warming is happening. And they're saying, you've read this sentence, do you believe it's happening? So as you can see, among this group of predominantly Republicans, about between a third and a half of them say, nah, not for me, don't believe global warming is happening. This kind of stuff has always been happening, always been going on. So they now say, all right, does showing people some data, some numbers, help? Is that more persuasive? So for this second group, still similar people who have initial view. Their initial view is very similar. Now they say, here's a paragraph with a load of stats in it. Now do you believe global warming is happening once you've been shown that sort of written evidence? And so among the moderate Republicans, a few of them are convinced. You go from about half saying, no, it's not happening, to about a third. Among the strong Republicans, there's maybe a little bit of a sort of backfire effect where they say, I've read this paragraph, I think it's a load of bollocks, I'm even more convinced that global warming is not happening. But basically, there's not a huge amount of difference. They've read a paragraph, they've seen some stats, and they're still going, no, I'm not having it. Third group, give them a chart. The chart shows global temperatures over the last few decades, and we find that suddenly that skepticism pretty much evaporates. You've gone from about half of people saying, I don't think global warming is happening, to about a tenth. And this is among a group who had pretty strong sort of political reasons to hold on to that view that it was not happening. And yet they see a chart and they're like, well, I can't argue with that. So pretty convincing evidence, pretty persuasive evidence, sort of in meta way, I've presented it in a chart form, but pretty convincing evidence that charts are more effective than many other ways of presenting information. And so, you know, whether it's me as a journalist, whether it's people working in the football industry, fundamentally, when we're making charts, we're trying to persuade something of something. We're trying to show them something. And the nice thing is we know that charts can do that. But not all charts are created equal. So what is it that makes a particular chart work? And the way I think about that, the way we think about that at Financial Times as people who make a hell of a lot of charts is you've got to actually think about how people consume charts. What's going on in someone's head when they see a chart or a map, a graphic? And the reason that might sound weird is that when we go through school, we're all taught not only how to write and how to read, but we're taught to do sort of critical analysis of text. Like, why does a certain way of writing something work better than a different way? The difference between like poetry and prose and like a sort of argument style, that kind of thing. But we're not really taught, in fact, we're not taught at all how that looks in chart form. Like, apart from should I make a bar chart or a pie chart, we're not really taught much about how should I make this chart actually speak to people. And I think essentially there's this assumption in the data visualization community that this is how people read charts. You present someone with a graphic and they've got their like ruler and their compass out and they're sort of interrogating this chart with a magnifying glass, trying to read off every individual number that went into that chart. That's what some of the tutorials around how to make charts kind of imply, that you should be optimizing for like super high detail, precision, accuracy. Whereas in my experience of making a lot of charts and getting a load of feedback on those charts, the way most people consume charts is a bit like this, or a bit like you guys here. Like, you're sat there, you're watching something, and you're being like, what is this telling me? You're not measuring things, you're not poring over it like it's a data set. You're saying, tell me something. And all of that is kind of a roundabout way of saying that data visualization is actually massively about how we use words in addition to how we use shape, space, and color, that kind of thing. And so again, I'm not just throwing that out there, I've not plucked that out of my arse, this is actually an evidence-based opinion. And so what the science says on this is really, really interesting. So there's a fascinating bit of research done out of the University of Washington in Seattle in the US a few years ago, where researchers wanted to answer exactly that question. Why is it that some charts, some graphics, some maps really cut through, resonate with people, and those people are able to recall them much later, whereas others don't? And so they did this really fascinating bit of research where they took hundreds of graphics, real-world graphics from the news, from textbooks, from that kind of thing. And they said, all right, we're going to show these to people just for a few seconds, around 10 seconds each, and just give people a snapshot and see which of these charts really stick with them. In the second phase, they then show them the same graphics, but only for a couple of seconds, and they're just testing did you remember this? Was this one of the charts that stuck with you? And then in the third phase, they blur the image, and they say, if you still recognize it now, tell us what it was. So it's kind of suited to this like modern environment where people talk about attention scarcity. We're being bombarded by notifications all the time. If you see a chart, it's maybe popping up on your social media feed or in an email. So people aren't going to see our charts forever. So how do we know what to do to make them memorable and easy to recall, even in a sort of 10-second snapshot? And so one of the interesting things they did in this study was they used eye tracking software to look at where does people's focus actually go when they're presented with a chart for a few seconds. And so I'm going to show you a little animation now, which they made. And this is going to loop, so if you miss it the first time, don't worry. And this is just showing a typical example from their research of where people's attention goes when they're presented with a chart. What you'll notice is the attention goes up to the title. There's a good bit of focus on that. Then they come down and see what's on the axis, and then they sort of read across the chart itself. But the point being, it's always attention to the title and then to the rest of the chart. And so I conceptualize that a bit like this, as this kind of Z shape. So whenever you're making a chart, whenever you're making a graphic, design it with that in mind. Like, people's attention is going to go across your title and then to the actual chart. So this title is like your sort of entry board, your on-ramp to the chart, and that is what's going to get people, bring them in, and help them to actually consume it, take the message that you're giving them. Again, the reason I'm talking about the focus on text and titles here is that in that same bit of research, they then took every participant's response when they were asked to describe the charts that they remembered from earlier, and they split it up into, when people are describing a chart that they remember, what do they mention? Do they mention like the colors, the shape, the title, the axes, that kind of thing. And they find that by far the most frequently mentioned things when someone says they remember a chart is the text. It's mainly the title, then it's other labels, paragraphs, that kind of thing. And the main plot area itself comes about fourth. Now, again, I'm obviously not saying, therefore, the actual chart doesn't matter at all and we should just be doing like chart titles. Then you're not getting all of the sort of advantages that charts give you that I showed at the start. You're not getting that sort of extra semblance of objectivity and just the shape and color which actually draws someone's attention. So do make charts, but really focus on nailing that text, because that is really how you're going to cut through and ensure that someone actually understands something. You know, it can seem like, why all this focus on understanding? But the focus on understanding is because I see data visualization as being fundamentally about conveying information to people. I always remember a time a few years ago when I'd made a graphic. It was actually it was a football stats chart showing the amount of pitch time that strikers in European football got, and how it's no good having really talented strikers if they hardly ever get on the pitch due to injury. And a friend of mine, a few days later, said to me, like, "Oh, I really loved your chart. It's really cool. I had no idea what it meant." And I thought, that's really weird. I'd never even considered the ideas that someone might like a chart but have no idea what it meant. To me, that's like someone saying, "I love this book, but I couldn't understand any of the words." And I know, you know, that's not everyone's view. Some people think that charts and data viz can actually be almost like a form of art. But for me, that's kind of wasteful, because if it's just about art, then why use real data at all? Whereas if you're actually trying to get something across to someone, you've really got to focus on that clarity of message. And I kind of see that conversation with my mate back then as like a sort of turning point, where up until that point, I'd been making more and more like cool, colourful, intricate charts without realizing that while all of my friends who worked in the data visualization space loved them, no one else had a clue what they were saying. So since then, I've very much gone back the other direction towards just focusing absolutely on clarity of message. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of what that's looked like over the last couple of years, from the COVID pandemic and beyond, in terms of just how I think this has really revealed the importance of focusing on charts as a form of communication. So this was an email that I got in early March 2020 from a colleague at the FT on the news desk. This was at a time, it's sort of crazy to think back to this time now when COVID was sort of just starting to become a thing in terms of like the sort of Western world. And there were terrible images and headlines coming out of northern Italy every day. But the big question everyone had, including my colleague here, was, are we going to end up where Italy is? What about the UK? What about the US? What about the rest of the world? Are we all heading in that same direction? So the brief was, how can we show that? Do we have the data? Can we have a chart that tells you that message? And this was the first draft, like version 0.0 of my response to that colleague. It was, okay, how about we do this, where we've got the number of days since an outbreak really took off in a country, going left to right, and then you've got the total number of cases that had accumulated in the country over time. Essentially showing, here's what Italy's path has looked like, the path from the start of the outbreak to where they are today, and here's what other countries' paths look like. And, you know, if you look at this chart, with all that blurb that I've given you, you can maybe see what this chart is trying to say. But this is not really a piece of communication. This is just some sort of scribbling on a notepad, as it were. This is a bit of analysis. It's the results of an analysis, but it's not a piece of communication. So how do I turn that into something that actually speaks to people? So step one is just putting it on the Financial Times sort of background, the Financial Times style. We always like to tell ourselves that the FT's background is pink. It's very clearly beige. I guess we think pink just sounds cooler. But that's me taking the same chart, put it on a nice background, change the fonts, do some little bits of neatening it up. But I would still say for most people, this doesn't speak to them. This is still something that maybe a majority of people in this room would get what this chart is saying, but it's still ultimately a chart for chart people. Like, for me, I find it really useful to think about the fact that most people in this country don't do maths at A-level. Like, people get to the age of 16, they're like, thank God, I can finally stop studying maths. Don't come near me with a spreadsheet ever again. And so whenever we make a chart that is made for people who are interested in charts and maths, we're kind of cutting everyone else out. It's like a little nod saying, yeah, this isn't for you, mate. And the biggest thing you can do to actually get around that and say, no, this chart is for everyone, is to just put some text on there. Put an actual message on there that says what your chart is trying to say. Like, this is a chart, and this is a bit of communication. And that's why, in early March, all of our stuff at the FT started getting absolutely enormous traction, way more than other people who were doing very similar things, but not focusing on text. So really, I just cannot stress enough, put a title on, tell people what your chart is saying, and the sort of audience of people who actually think this is now for them and are actually going to start engaging with your content is going to be vastly, vastly higher. Just to give you another more recent non-COVID example, this was a piece I did last week looking at income inequality in different countries. Again, this is a load of spaghetti, right? This is not easy to work out what I'm trying to say with this chart. There's a load of data on here. If you looked at it for 5 minutes, you might start getting some takeaways. But it's really complex, and it's certainly not speaking to people who don't, consume charts every day. But you put a title on there, and it starts becoming clearer. And it's not just that the title says to people what the chart shows, it's that they can then start to actually learn what charts are doing. They can see the fact that I'm saying, okay, in Norway, people right across the income distribution have high living standards. They look at the chart, they see there's a green Norway thing at the top. So they're learning like high up in the chart means high in income. So you're not only helping someone understand their chart that's right in front of them, you're kind of teaching them to read charts along the way. Another really interesting bit of research in this space in terms of how words matter. This was a study done a few years ago, again out of the US, where the researchers took a load of graphics, showed them to very much non-chart people who lived in like rural America. There was like farmers, people who worked in factories, that kind of thing. And they just said, rank these charts. Which of these do you like? Which do you not like? And in this example, you've got two charts showing drug overdoses in America. They're both actually showing the same data, but one of them says overdose death rates in America, and the other one doesn't. And so people say, well, I like the one that said overdose death rates in America, because I'm in America, and so that immediately speaks to me. It's so basic, but it's just an immediate example of give someone a reason to think that your chart is speaking to them, and you're instantly speaking to far, far, far more people. So the very clear lesson there is that use text, use annotations, and your charts are no longer something for people like you, for people like us who make charts. They're for people like us, but they're also for literally everyone else. You know, I had like school friends who I've not spoken to for 15 years get in touch with me during the pandemic and say, my mum just WhatsApped me one of your graphs. Like, there's no way that friend's mum was doing that if I'd sent them a graph with no text on it. Another thing we found that was really interesting was just how people can get confused by and thrown by things in a chart that you might never anticipate. So one thing you might notice in this chart that we did at the start of the pandemic was the y-axis. We've got these sort of uneven gaps between the numbers, and it goes 100, 200, 500 instead of 100, 200, 300. So what's going on there? That's basically the question that loads of people had on Twitter at the time. Everyone looked at that and they were like, what on earth is going on? This seems dodgy. Are you massaging the numbers? What's happening? Now, we had thought, well, this was just a really sort of objectively, mathematically smart thing to do, to use a logarithmic axis. And I can see I'm already losing half the room as I say those words. But that's kind of the point. Use a log axis because it's a great way to show exponential data. What does the average person in the street see? They see like, what on earth is going on with your axis? This just seems dodgy. But instead of thinking, okay, well, clearly we were wrong. We were being the sort of nerds in our ivory tower, and actually no one understands this. Instead of thinking that, or the opposite, instead of thinking, you bunch of idiots, I can't believe you don't know what a log scale is, I don't care, we said, let's actually try and come to a compromise. So did some more Twitter explainers, tweeted out, here's why we're using the log scale, here's what this is and why we're doing it. We ended up doing a video talking through exactly what it is. You know, this chart was getting so many eyeballs every day. We were like, we need to actually help people understand this. And that was really cool because what we then saw starting to happen was other people, rather than me and colleagues, other people going out and saying, don't worry, it's a log scale, this is what it does, it's cool. They've done a video, it explains it. So by actually, again, treating the audience as people who are part of a conversation and not people who are sort of down there being talked to, you bring people along and you build up a much larger audience for this stuff. The other thing I always like to point out is if you can just about make out on the left-hand side, two of the Twitter users who had initially said they didn't understand this chart, one of them, the account is now suspended, and the other one, the account no longer exists. So I like to think that's sort of, if you don't get log scales, you're basically not for Twitter. And that brings me on to one of my favorite charts of the whole pandemic, which is the Google search interest in logarithmic scale. And that basically shot up when we and other people started doing these charts. And the point being, if you don't tell people what a logarithmic scale is, they wouldn't know what to Google. Like, they would just see this chart and go, that's weird, I don't get it, and they move on. If you actually try and have a conversation, walk people through something, they're going to learn. And so, don't get me wrong, I absolutely don't think everyone now understands log scales. I think we've gone from like 0.1% of the population to 1% maybe, and it's probably nowhere near 1%. But we wouldn't have moved from 0.1% at all if we hadn't talked to people and said, here's what we're trying to do here. So the lesson, again, very much being, if someone's confused by a chart that you've made, that's your fault. You don't get to just say, well, if you don't get it, you're dumb, because then you've just lost a potential person who could have been persuaded by what you're showing. But if they are confused, work with them. Don't just sort of insist that they're wrong. Neither do you need to throw away everything. Actually, just make it into a conversation. Another really interesting thing we found, though, was it wasn't just that people were confused by that log scale. They almost felt like we were doing something political with it. People were saying, oh, because of the way you're plotting this data, it makes it look like the pandemic is getting less bad. It's like you're sort of doing the Tory party's PR. You're making things look less bad than they are by your choice of axis. Again, this is something that we had never possibly considered in a million years, and yet it was something that people actually thought. So the thing we took from that was like everyone who interacts with a graphic that you produce is going to come with their own like personal context. People were obviously coming to our charts thinking, God, the situation in the UK is terrible and the government's really getting away with it. And they were seeing our chart and thinking, and you're just part of the problem. There's no way we could have sort of predicted that, but that's where we were. And I think it's just useful to think about that fact, that you kind of want to minimize the chance that someone just gets thrown by or like has a negative reaction to a graphic that you've produced. Think about it in the football space. Like, if you were one of the first people to show that shots from distance were generally a poor decision and resulted in worse outcomes than shots from close range, if you took that to Thomas Hitzelsberger, he'd have been furious. That's his entire thing. But you could show that same data, but give people like a sort of an intro, give them some context, and maybe don't put a sort of inflammatory title on there, but just really think about, again, a chart is a piece of communication, and you want to minimize the chance that someone thinks, well, this is a load of bollocks. Another thing you can do is, this is the sort of cop-out or compromise, but if you have the infrastructure to support it, just make an interactive chart where people can actually make their own choices about how they want to display the information. So this is what we ended up doing. Instead of just sticking to our original chart where we're saying we were going to stick to a log axis, we said, here's an interactive version. You can choose whether you want to show things on linear or log, and people love this one. So ultimately, the customer is always right, and so give them the choice. But try and make these things into a conversation. Another really interesting moment we had was on this issue of the sort of trade-off between clarity, accessibility, understanding, and sort of mathematical objectivity. So this was in the question of how we should smooth some data points on a chart. So for anyone who ever looked at the raw data on COVID, which I realise as I say that is hopefully no one in this room because it's an incredibly nerdy thing for anyone to have done. This is what the raw data on things like COVID deaths look like crazy sort of tooth-shaped patterns, like deaths going up to like 1,000 and then down to 0 almost overnight. And that was because, it wasn't because 1,000 people died one day and 0 died the next. It's because the data is just really, really messy. This was people scrambling to actually collect these numbers together. And so you got really weird things where, you know, it was bank holiday maybe, and so no one reported any deaths, even though there were some. Or someone found a folder down the back of the filing cabinet, and they were like, oh, we've got another few hundred deaths here that we forgot about. The point being, the data was a complete mess. And if we just plotted that on a chart, everyone would have gone like, this is crazy, like, how do we trust this? So the question was, do you do a 7-day rolling average? Do you just do a nice, simple rolling average? You say, okay, we know that there's some like weekly cyclicality in the data, so let's do a 7-day average, and then you've got a better idea of how things look. Or do you try and be a bit nerdier and you say, we're going to do a sort of smoothing spline, which is just a more sort of scientific version of the rolling average, which tries to detect the underlying patterns in the data and give you a less noisy version than you would get either from the real data or from a simple smoothed average. And we thought, well, maybe the spline is actually the way to go here. You know, it's that little bit more statistically rigorous, but also crucially it means that the final data point on any given line is much closer to the most recent data point that was reported than with a rolling average. Because with a 7-day rolling average, you're averaging the last 7 days, so that number is going to represent the average of the last week rather than yesterday. Whereas with a spline, it's closer to yesterday. The reason we thought that was worth doing is people are listening to the radio every day, they're hearing a certain number of cases or deaths. We want our charts to look as close as possible to what they've just heard on the radio. And so if you look at how this compares on the left, a simple rolling average, and the right, a spline, the spline gets a lot closer to that daily number that people are hearing on the radio. But when we sort of put this to the public and said, all right, we've come up with these two options, which do you prefer, 7-day average or a spline? Again, we got this really interesting array of responses. Broadly speaking, other people who work in the data space said, oh yeah, splines are great, I do splines, it's a smart way to go. And, you know, broader members of the public said, I don't really know what splines are, rolling averages are much easier, much more simple. Most of the public have no idea what a spline is, and as soon as you hear a word that you don't recognize, you're going to be like, what's going on there? So the lesson we took from that, and we stuck to the 7-day average, is you should be prioritizing for ease of understanding. Again, it makes no sense to sort of think, oh, we can be that tiny bit more precise, that tiny bit more correct on our chart if you're going to lose half of your audience along the way. But that doesn't always mean the same thing. And actually, I think, in a way, the mistake I made with that chart was to talk really enthusiastically about splines. Like, as soon as people heard that word, they were like, well, this is no longer for me. So it's actually just, the danger is you blind people with science. So to give another example where I took a completely different approach, this was another COVID data set where we're comparing the status of an outbreak in Cape Town with one in Manaus in Brazil. Again, the raw data was that super, super noisy gray line. The blue line there is a 7-day average, and the red one is a nice smooth spline. Now, I looked at this and I thought, what lesson am I going to take from what I just took about? Is my lesson that I should do the rolling average, because that's the thing that everyone understands? And I thought, actually, no, I think the lesson is just show people the clearest data, the clearest representation of the data you can, which is the smooth red line, but don't actually mention the word spline. So plotted the smoothest data, plotted the version that is most easy to read, doesn't have any random bumps and noise in there, but I just say smooth averages instead of saying a spline. So the fact is, we know from loads of experience, people don't even read subheadings and footnotes and stuff on charts. So focus on your chart conveying the message that the data shows, and then just try not to confuse them by throwing other words in there. So kind of the dirty secret there is that sometimes, even if you've done something really cool and advanced behind the scenes and you kind of want to shout about it, you will literally lose more people by doing that than will benefit from the fact that you've done it. So there's sort of a paradox almost that sometimes, whether we're working with charts or with words, you can actually convey more information by saying less. And then just one other thing I want to talk about, and this goes broader than charts and data visualization, but I think for any of us who work in any role where you're trying to communicate with people, you're trying to get things across to people, It's just the importance of feedback and of making what you do into a conversation rather than just a sort of one-way relationship where you produce something and then you walk away. So something we found very early on in the pandemic was we were getting an enormous amount of feedback, enormous amount of responses to the charts that we were publishing. And usually, like for most journalists, they'll publish a chart and they'll walk away. They'll be like, all right, what's next? And if you do that, you miss out on all of that feedback that you're getting to your work that could massively help you refine what you do. So we ended up setting up a specific email inbox just for people to tell us what they liked or didn't like about these charts. And this was just less than 1 day's worth of emails into that inbox from people telling us all sorts of things. There's people on there saying, we love the charts, and so those people obviously think are great. There's other people saying, we don't love the charts at all. I actually think those people are even greater because then they told us like what we should do to make the charts better. There's people saying, had you considered doing this? There's people saying, I found some data that you don't have. The point being, because we actually asked people to give feedback, we learned an absolutely enormous amount about what makes certain charts work and certain charts not work. Like, if you're in the business of making charts and you're always focused on making the absolute perfect chart, and so maybe you put like 10 things out in a year, you just learn so much less than if you do maybe a little bit less of that sort of final refinement, but you publish 100 charts, you learn absolutely loads more. So I guess lesson there just being, make this into a continued conversation. Whenever you're putting a chart out there, ask people what they think of it, and just produce a lot of work. Like high volume work, you'll just get so much more feedback. So to sort of wrap that all into one thing, the overarching theme again is if you're making charts, think about them as communication. You're really trying to bring people along with you, whether this is a one-on-one situation, you're talking to a football player, or whether you're talking to a larger audience, either of football fans or the wider public. What you're surely trying to do is communicate. You're trying to get a message across. And so just have that at the forefront of your mind when you're making your chart. Really think about how you use text. And just think you want this to be something that anyone can understand, regardless of whether there's someone who sees and indeed makes charts every day, or whether there's someone who dropped maths when they were 16 and, frankly, just wants nothing to do with it. So that concludes my bit. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions if anyone has any. So I'm just going to make that opportunity, but if not, then no worries.
Any questions, anyone?
Thank you. Is there an optimal length in terms of words for your titles?
That's a really interesting question. So generally, we say like 2 lines on your chart, but I think really there's sort of an optimal width of a chart is almost a bigger thing. Like once your text runs too long horizontally, it's just that much harder for someone to get in a snapshot. So the interesting thing for us at the FT is, even though I'm thinking about a chart title, all my colleagues, they're thinking about it as a headline. Yeah, we've got people who've been spending decades on writing news headlines, and they've learned sort of the art of saying something in a snappy way that is kind of eye-catching and that you can get in one glance. So I think generally 2 lines and probably no more than about 10 words per line is the way to do it. So that if someone even sees that for 2 seconds, they're taking it all in one view. They're not having to read across like that. I think that's what I would say.
Any more?
Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, John. How do you design differently for mobile versus desktop?
Great question. So about between 2/3 and 3/4 of our traffic at the FT is now on mobile phones. So even if I spend hours making a really cool, like, high-res chart that if you've got a massive, like, desktop screen, you could pore over it for hours, that's only about 1/4 of people who are actually going to see that. So on mobile, my approach is always to I often almost think about it as like a separate chart. And I just think, what's the key thing that I want to get across from this chart and get rid of everything else? So like in that example that I showed earlier about income distributions, I've got like 5 small multiples in the desktop chart, but I only had 2 of those in the mobile. It's sort of thinking, sure, if someone's in front of a big screen, they've probably actually got more time, so they can dig deeper into a more detailed chart. If someone's on mobile, it's not just that the screen's small, it's that they're probably in a tube carriage or something. They've only got 30 seconds of internet, and so I want it to be something they can get quicker. So I just think core message and really distill it down. Like another example might be, I might do like a scatter plot or something on desktop, but then the summarized like bar chart version of that on mobile. So just really thinking about people on mobile screens, it's small, you don't have a huge amount of time, make it super simple. And then I guess the extension of that is you don't necessarily have the time to be making multiple versions of every chart. So just always go mobile first. Like if your chart is only going to really like work on either mobile or on a massive desktop screen, optimize it for mobile, because that's where the vast majority of people are going to see it, especially when most people are seeing charts on stuff like Twitter these days.
First of all, I want to thank you for coming today. Genuinely appreciate it. This is kind of a fun moment to come full circle, especially with some recent book releases. So where did we first meet in person?
That is a really good question. There were early Opta and StatsBomb events.
So it was Chris Anderson's book release for the Numbers Game, and I think Rory was hosting it. And then you met me afterwards, rocked up on your bicycle. John's a famous cyclist, loves cycling, loves pasta. Homemade pasta is a thing you got into.
If you love endurance sport, you kind of have to love carbs. So yeah.
So this is like 2013. This is like sort of the formation of a lot of this stuff. And I'd been looking at John's stuff. You were at a different employer at the time. Your expertise that you've built up over the last sort of 9 years is kind of incredible. Like, I think you were lecturing a little bit about data science and data visualization at that time. And then you worked for the Guardian infographics as well. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think at that point about like what's changed over those 9 years is really interesting as well, because I did back in 2012, I think it was, Man City released this there was this MCFC analytics thing and made some Opta data public for people to use, and I had to play around with that and made something that at the time I thought was really cool. But again, if I looked at that now, it was not only absolutely visually hideous, but it had absolutely no message. It was something that I had enjoyed making, but that didn't mean it had any actual value as a data visualization. I think the nice thing for me has been I can look back on stuff like that now and loads of other things that I made and at the time loved. And I'm like, those things, I made those for me, not for other people.
Well, what I think is illustrative for both your career and kind of football analytics as well is like what a deep expertise you build by doing something over and over again, and not just like looking at the same chart, but how do I communicate this a little bit better? How do I find a slightly different way to do something? But the flip side of that is, if you need to communicate that to an audience, you want them to be comfortable with the information. And so there's this balance between like adjusting things to improve it while also making sure that it's not so jarring that you throw them off and you make them suspicious, or like you're biased or you're reflecting your personal impression on it.
Yeah, totally. And I think like some of the stuff like the radar charts that you folks really sort of took off with back in that similar time is a really interesting example where someone might look at that and say, for these objective reasons, radar charts are bad. Like they don't do a job. But very clearly they did do a job because you just kept doing them and you got people familiar with them and you taught people through them and you iterated on them, but you never just said, screw it, we're not doing radars anymore. And I think that again is the key part here. There's no such thing as like a wrong chart type as long as you make it into a conversation and talk people through it. Like if you just published some radars and walked off, maybe they wouldn't have worked. But it was the fact that you were there making this a conversation that I think made them really succeed.
Yeah, and had some pretty big names, some of whom have been on this stage, at least virtually last year, take swipes at them. And that was fine because we needed to talk, we need to have a conversation. And in some cases, a very public conversation, exactly like you're talking about in the pandemic space, on the FT, getting feedback. What don't you like? What do you think is generically wrong about this? And then you're like, well, that doesn't quite work actually, because we've solved those generic complaints in these ways. And what the reality is you're quant. And quant, you don't give a shit about the graphs and the charts anyway, right? You give a shit about the numbers and how everything works there. But when you bring it all back full circle, I'm not communicating with you. You already know this. I have to communicate with these other people over here. And you do it via iteration, and you do it via communication, and you do it via conversation. Once they become comfortable, then hopefully, at least you have the opportunity to have that conversation, you start to bring them on board. This is such a smart talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. John Burn-Murdoch, everybody.